Good morning. Would you open your Bibles to John 18, please? John 18. As we prepare our minds to take the Lord's Supper, I want us to think about the unrecognized King of the Jews. In John 18, Jesus is standing trial before Pontius Pilate. And it says in verse 33, John 18:33, "Therefore Pilate entered again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, 'Are you the King of the Jews?'" Remember when Jesus was born, the wise men came from the east and they assigned him the title, the King of the Jews. He will die with that same title above his cross. I want us to appreciate why that title is so significant, why Jesus was born and died, the King of the Jews. There had been no King of the Jews for 600 years, all the way back to 586 BC when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians. And ever since then, the Jews, they were ruled over by pagan, Gentile kings. First the Babylonians, and then the Medo-Persians, and then the Greeks, and now, in the time of Jesus, the Romans are the ruling kings over them, specifically Emperor Tiberius Caesar. And the Jews hated that the Gentiles were kings over them. They hated the spiritual defilement that came from living in a land ruled by pagans. And there were a lot of Jewish revolts against those powers throughout their history. In fact, there were even Jewish revolts against Pontius Pilate, the guy mentioned here in verse 33. Pilate was a Roman military governor, and he was serving under Caesar in order to keep the peace in Jerusalem. Well, on one occasion, not recorded in the Bible, Pilate was in the holy city of Jerusalem, and he and his soldiers were carrying around Roman flags with them, and on the top of the flags were little images of the Emperor Caesar. Well, the Jews took issue with that because Rome promoted emperor worship, and the Jews believed those were graven images to another god, essentially, being paraded through the streets of their holy city, Jerusalem. So they asked Pilate to remove them and to stop doing that, and Pilate refused. See, interestingly, the governors that preceded, that came before Pilate, they were much more open to be flexible with the Jews and sort of respecting their religious scruples and working with them. Pilate did not care. And so Pilate, he ended up marching anyway with those flags, and the Jews followed him around and his soldiers for days until Pilate got so annoyed he threatened to kill the Jews. And the Jews, they stuck their necks out and they said, "You go ahead and kill us." And Pilate, unfortunately, he couldn't kill them, because then that would have caused chaos, and then he would really be in big trouble with the emperor. Well, the Jews, they reported Pilate. They told on him, essentially, to Caesar, and Pilate was beaten as punishment. And he was forced from that point forward to remove those images when traveling through Jerusalem. On another occasion, not recorded in Scripture, the Jews needed a water supply, and Pilate built an aqueduct for them, but he raided the treasury of the temple in order to pay for it. And of course, the Jews were furious about it, and they rioted in the streets, and Pilate ordered his soldiers to dress up like Jews and disguise themselves among the Jews and start stabbing them to death. In the Bible, actually, in Luke 13:1, Jesus mentions another occasion of problems between Pilate and the Jews, where he says Pilate mixed the blood of some Galilean Jews with their sacrifices. So I'm pointing all this out to help you see that Pilate hated the Jews. Hey, I think sometimes we read the account, and Pilate's so reasonable about Jesus, and he says he's innocent and all that. You almost kind of feel like Pilate's a really good guy or something, but he hates the Jews hate him. And when we read this trial, it's really, everything that happens is more of a political wrestling match between Pilate and the Jews. That's really what's going on, is that this is a power play. Who has the power, Pilate or the Jews? And Jesus gets caught in the crossfire of that political power play, as if he did not matter at all, because neither the Jews nor Pilate actually recognized Jesus as king. Jesus, the unrecognized King of the Jews, was used by Pilate as a pawn to humiliate the Jews, and Jesus let him do it. And I think once you appreciate the hostility between the Jews and Pilate, you'll see it kind of jump off the page. So look in John 18. Let's go back earlier to verse 28. It says, "Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early, and they themselves did not enter into the praetorium so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover." So right off the bat, we see the hypocrisy of these particular Jews. They're worried about being defiled by entering Pilate's pagan residence, but they're perfectly fine with putting an innocent man to death. Continue reading verses 29 and 30. "Therefore Pilate went out to them and said, 'What accusation do you bring against this man?' And they answered and said to him, 'If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you.'" You see the snarky attitude? I mean, the Jews are saying, "What kind of dumb question is that, Pilate? You really think we'd bring him to you if he wasn't guilty? I mean, he is guilty, and now it's your job to do something about it." Continue reading verses 31 and 32. "So Pilate said to them, 'Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law.' And the Jews said to him, 'We are not permitted to put anyone to death,' to fulfill the word of Jesus which he spoke, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die." I believe this was a jab by Pilate in response to the Jews' attitude, because the Jews, they're treating Pilate like he's their puppet, like he just exists to do their bidding. But by telling them to handle this on their own, it reminded them who is really in power. It's not the Jews, because the Romans took away their power to execute people. If the Jews had the power to put Jesus to death, they would have stoned him to death. That's how the Jews executed people. But instead, they had to appeal to the higher powers over them, which was Rome. And the way Romans executed people was not by stoning. It was by crucifixion. Which means Jesus' earlier prophecy in John chapter 12 that he would be lifted up on a cross to die, that's why it was fulfilled. Jesus didn't say, "I'll be stoned to death." He said, "I'll be lifted up." Because the Jews did not have power to stone him. And I think Pilate is sort of reminding the Jews of their proper place here. Well, back in verse 33, which we read earlier, when he asked Jesus, "Are you the King of the Jews?" Because that's really the charge that the Jews brought Jesus up on, claiming to be King of the Jews, because they knew that would get the Romans' attention. They did not bring him before Pilate on the charge that he claimed to be the Son of God. The Romans really wouldn't care that much about that enough to put him to death. But to say he claimed to be king would be seen as a direct threat to Caesar. So what you see is, sadly, this grand title, King of the Jews, was used not as a genuine recognition of who Jesus really was, but as a manipulative tactic for the Jews to get their way here. Well, Jesus and Pilate, they have a conversation about the meaning of this title, King of the Jews, and Jesus assures Pilate that, yes, he is the King of the Jews, but his kingdom is not of this world, so you don't have to worry about us forming an army and going and storming, Caesar's home. No. That's not the kind of king he came to establish. And so Pilate, he finds no guilt in him at all, and he tries to get Jesus released. Look in verses 39 and 40. He says, "You have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you wish then that I release for you the King of the Jews?" And they cried out again, saying, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. Pilate was hoping that they would choose to release Jesus. And he probably thought there's just no way that they're going to choose Barabbas over Jesus. Barabbas was a robber, and Mark's gospel tells us he was an insurrectionist, someone who actually did revolt and rebel against the Roman government. So not only do they trade an innocent man for a guilty man, they show favor to a man who rebels against the Roman government while they simultaneously are working with the Roman government against Jesus. They're siding with the Roman king and rebelling against God's king. They are making themselves out to be friends with Caesar because, hey, we've got Caesar's back. We're just looking out for him. I mean, this guy's claiming to be king. He might just overthrow Caesar. Their hypocrisy and their betrayal. is pathetic and tragic. So Pilate has Jesus scourged, in part, I believe, still to have Jesus released, to garner some sympathy and let him go. And he has Jesus dressed up like a king with a purple robe and a crown of thorns, and the soldiers slap him in the face, and then we see that title again. Look in chapter 19 and verse 3. They began to come up to him and say, "Hail, King of the Jews," and to give him slaps in the face. Once again, the title there is not being used as a genuine recognition of who Jesus is. It's used to mock and humiliate him. And then Pilate brings Jesus out before the Jews, and he says, "Behold the man." In other words, does he really look like a king? I mean, does he really look like a man capable of insurrection against the Romans? But the Jews don't care, and they cry out, "Crucify him." And so in verse 12 of chapter 19, as a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar." Think about this. The Jews, they hated Caesar. For centuries, they hated being ruled over by pagan kings. And now suddenly they're acting like they're his friends. And they actually resort to blackmailing Pilate. Because remember, Pilate has been in hot water with the emperor before because of problems with the Jews. And now they're threatening to tell Caesar, if Pilate releases Jesus, they're going to tell him what he did. And now he's going to be in hot water all over again. So now Pilate, politically, he's stuck. He has no recourse in his mind but to do what the Jews ask. And I think because he's so stuck, and the Jews have put him in this horrendous position, his new goal is to mock and humiliate the Jews as he has Jesus killed. Pilate brings Jesus out to them in verse 14, and he says, "Behold your king." He is taunting them because he knew they rejected Jesus as their king. He knew that they would hate that. And then in verse 15, when they shout, "Crucify him," he asks again, "Shall I crucify your king?" Again, the title king there, it's not being used as a genuine recognition of who Jesus is. Here, it's being used as a way to mock the Jews. And their response is chilling. At the end of verse 15, the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." The Jews are revolting against their true king, Jesus, and they are professing allegiance to a pagan king, something their people for centuries would have never done. They've completely sold themselves out. So Pilate leads Jesus away to be crucified, and he has one last opportunity to mock and humiliate the Jews. Because whenever somebody was crucified, they would take a placard and they would put it over their cross with an inscription of the reason for which this person was killed. And look at the charge Pilate wrote on Jesus' placard, down in verse 19 and 20. Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross, and it was written, "Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews." Therefore, many of the Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek. Now, of course, the Jews are not happy about this because, again, Pilate is mocking them. He's sticking it to them. Here's the King of the Jews. They hate that. And so what they say in verse 21 is, no, don't write King of the Jews. Write, "He claimed to be the King of the Jews." But Pilate refuses to make the change. And so in verse 22, Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." It was Pilate's way of getting the last laugh against the Jews. Essentially, it was a way to mock their powerlessness. It's a way to say, you all are so weak and pathetic that this weak, beaten, defeated man is the only king you'll ever have. And how ironic, because he was exactly right. Jesus was their king. And when we stand back and look at the accounts of John 18 and 19, it's amazing to see how none of them recognized Jesus as king. But God did. And in his brilliance, God used the hateful hearts of the Jews and of Pilate and the Roman soldiers to proclaim Jesus' kingship to the world. Think about it. Even though none of these were genuine, Pilate still proclaimed Jesus the king publicly 3 times. The soldiers still dressed him in a royal robe, and they put a crown of thorns on his head, and they hailed him as King of the Jews. And then Pilate's inscription, King of the Jews, above the cross, was translated in all 3 major languages of the world at that time, so that the entire world would know that he was indeed the King of the Jews. And then the Roman soldiers lifted him up on high for everyone to see, seated and enthroned upon the cross with that crown of thorns on his head. As we partake of the Lord's Supper this morning, we're saying to Jesus, I recognize you as King. We're saying, Hail, King of the Jews, not in a mocking way, but in a genuine sense. We are hailing him as our King and our Messiah, and we're giving our lives to him because he gave his life for us. Instead of saying, we have no king but Caesar, we're saying to him, we have no king but Jesus. And I love to imagine that if I were there at Jesus' trial, and I'm not arrogantly saying, well, I would have recognized him as king. I don't know. I hope that I would not be in that mocking crowd. I hope that I would be recognizing him. But I like to imagine that if I were there, after seeing Jesus beaten and mocked and scourged and dressed in that purple robe, I would love to have been able to walk up to him and say, I see you. I recognize you. You are the king. You are my king. And I wonder how that would have made Jesus feel to know that someone recognized him. I know we weren't there, but when we partake of the Lord's Supper, we can say that to him. We can recognize him as the king who gave his body and blood to save us. We can hail and recognize the unrecognized King of the Jews.